Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another edition of your Gardening Week. This is the spot to come to get your gardening questions answered, learn about what problems others are having to help you on your journey to becoming a better gardener, and just to have the opportunity to chat with me and other gardeners and have a wonderful time on a Monday to get ready for your gardening week. Got a lot to talk about over the next 90 minutes. There's going to be a big focus today on the things that are going wrong in our gardens and how to deal with them. Because for most of us, this is our prime growing season, but that also means this is prime season for things to go wrong, and it can be very discouraging. So hang in there, lots of negative stuff to talk about today, but there's also lots of positive lessons to learn along the way. So check in, let us know where you're from. We've already got people from Indonesia to Nevada to California to Canada, Idaho. It's so good to see all the normal people coming back and a lot of first-time viewers as well. So the way this works is go ahead and ask a question. I'll be covering questions from last week that I didn't have time to answer, and I'll be covering a lot of questions from this week just to be sure that we cover some of the more time-sensitive issues. And along the way, if you've got an answer, throw an answer in there, because I can't get to every question and I can't give you all the information you're looking for. But there's some very knowledgeable people that are present on this chat. I'll point out Heidi Clark. She's here every week. She's got great information. If Heidi gives you an answer, I say pretty much you can trust that answer. So thank you, Heidi, for all the work you do in these chats. And let's go ahead and get to the very first question, which comes from Scott McClay. And this is such a good question. He started it as the very first one today, but I'm going to highlight this as the question of the week. I think it's so good. It is. I was watching a video that I released last night. It was about the severe damage that my garden sustained after a hailstorm a few days ago. So I'm guessing that's the reason Scott's asking this question. The reason it's such a great question is because when things start going wrong in your garden, you want to recover. You want to put new plants in. You want to put new seeds in. Sometimes you have utter devastation like I did, where you have completely lost plants. And a lot of you shared your experiences this year and from past years where you lost entire gardens because of weather-related events. Well, when you replant, be it a tomato, a pepper, or a brand new seed, you need to think about the life of that plant. How long is it going to take to grow before you can get to the harvest, since I'm assuming that's one of the reasons you're growing the plants. So tomatoes and peppers in particular take a good amount of time. We're talking at least 2, usually 3 months before they're going to provide a harvest. So you have to anticipate your own growing season. Do you have enough time left in your growing season to recover? In my case, where I lost a lot of my peppers, I don't think I'm going to have any peppers this year because I only have about 3 months left in my growing season. And the peppers that I want to grow are 80 to 90 day varieties. That means if I put a brand new plant that I get from the nursery into the ground today, I can expect 80 to 90 days to get a harvest. Well, I just don't have enough time left in my growing season. The same holds true with tomatoes. I did replant some tomatoes that are 60 and 70 day tomatoes, so I should be able to get a harvest before the first frost hits in fall. I'm not holding out much hope for the peppers. But you've got to figure out how long your growing season is. When is your first frost? And so if you replant or if you put in new seeds, will you have enough time left in the growing season? And this is one of those issues where if you put tomato plants in the ground, say in May, you know you've got enough time. Well, then if your tomato plants are devastated in mid, or in my case now late June, just because tomatoes always do well in the garden, well, I've lost all of the time of May and now all of the time of June where my tomato plants would have been growing. So the clock is always ticking. When you put seeds and plants in the ground, sometimes you just may not have enough time, which means you may need to choose a different type of plant to go into that same space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this live stream when I talk about today's philosophy. So, good to see everybody checking in. We've already got 130 people on the chat, and it's only been 5 minutes. So wonderful to see everybody, the new people, the returning people. I see a lot of comments, a lot of questions that are already popping up. I will say, especially if you're new to the live stream, the way to get my attention is to actually type in Gardener Scott in your comment. If you type Gardener Scott in the comment, or if you do @Gardener Scott, then it tends to highlight my name, which means it's much more likely that I'll see your question and be able to answer it today. If you just put a question, even if you answer it 3 or 4 times, because the chat moves pretty quickly, I may not see the question. And it's nothing personal. I just may not see it because I'm looking at the camera and I'm not always looking at the chat. So if you want to get my attention, go ahead and put my name in the discussion and it's much more likely to catch my attention. Another question that came up earlier today, this comes from Brian. Do you have advice on treating a current infestation of squash vine borers? There are 2 generations a year in my location, so removing damaged plants and replanting isn't effective. This is another great question. And this really puts the onus on you in learning about the pests in your garden and learning about their life cycle. Once you have an infestation of borers or another pest that's eating your plants or your roots or your actual fruits, it's often difficult to get rid of them. You can use chemical means, you can use mechanical means, but some of the best control methods are prevention. And so particularly in this case, there isn't a lot that can be done right now if there are borers in your plants. They're going to bore. And so unless you use some chemical that's systemic to get in the plant to kill those borers, and those might not even work, it's going to be a little late. So learn about the life cycle, because a lot of times these insects, these pests, live in our soil over the winter as grubs or eggs or other types of larvae. And all you might have to do is just dig up your soil, just disrupt their life cycle. And then next season, you won't have a problem. Sometimes you can't do anything about it now, but especially if you've got 2 generations each year. If you learn how you can disrupt the first generation from laying eggs and reproducing, then you may not have that second generation at all. And next year, the problem may be completely solved. So learn about the insects and the life cycles. So great to see people checking in. You figured it out. Newy99 says, new from Brighton, UK. Just started new veg garden and moving to Cornwall. That's wonderful. So you're way behind. There's nothing wrong with that. I encourage people to get started right away. When I moved to this new house, I was starting my garden within the first week. Not a lot in the way of plants, but as far as the planning and the building and the preparation, that's the way to do it. So congratulations on your move. I hope you get started pretty well. Oh, it's moving really fast. Okay, TD is saying, looks like a little more than 10 days of 95 plus weather coming to Colorado soon. Yeah, I saw that. Any more tips for helping garden other than water and shade? It's mainly just water and shade and patience and keeping your fingers crossed if you have change in weather. And some of you earlier had pointed out that you've been exposed to a lot of rain. We're now having the opposite. We went from some water and rain and hail, and now we're moving to hot and dry. Patience, particularly in the hot, dry days of summer. All you can do is just keep your soil moist. That may mean extra watering, and try to keep your plants shaded if you start seeing them really succumb to that heat. And one of the ways to do that is wilting. Now, wilting is a normal activity of plants. Most plants will wilt during the heat of the day, and then they'll perk up in the cooler evening hours. If you see your plants perking up, then you're probably doing things okay. But if you notice that later in the day, as the temperatures cool and the sun starts to set, that your plants are not perking up again, that they're still wilted, you definitely need to look at how you're watering the plants, check your soil moisture levels, and consider adding the shade component. Okay, Steve Balk had said that the tomato hornworms are back. I'll watch birds pick them off, but I check early morning and late evening. Any tips on how to get rid of them? I say try to attract more birds. I've said this about a lot of bug issues in earlier chats and videos. Your birds are the friend. So if you're already seeing the birds pick off your tomato hornworms, enlist that army to help. Getting out there is exactly the right thing to do. Try to pick them off at every opportunity. Also consider Bacillus thuringiensis. It's sold as BT. And BT is a bacteria that you can put on your leaves. And when the caterpillars eat your leaves, they ingest the BT and it will kill the caterpillar. So, kind of a three-pronged approach. Bring in the birds, pick them off by hand, and consider using BT. So wonderful to see everyone else checking in. Cup of Juice is asking, hey Scott, how was your son's first Father's Day? And I actually saw my son check in a little bit earlier, so I'm not sure if he's still on. I mentioned last week that it was my son's first Father's Day, which was actually one of the best gifts and led to the enjoyment of my own Father's Day, which was to see him responding to his new son. And I get to see them in just a couple days. They're coming at the end of this week. So I'll say this a couple times in the video today. I'm not having a live stream next Monday. There will be no show on July 6th. Primarily because I've got family here and we're going to be visiting rather than focusing on live streaming and the Gardener Scott channel. So thank you for asking that question. The Father's Day went well for me, and from what I saw, it went very well for him as well. But don't look for us next week because we will be visiting each other and enjoying the opportunity for me to see my grandson for the very first time, which I think is actually incredible. Patricia is asking, does BT hurt beneficial insects? That's one of the really cool things about BT. It's a bacteria that is ingested by the pest, caterpillars usually. And beneficial insects are not eating the leaves of our plants. So BT will only harm the insects that are eating the leaves. Beneficial insects are not eating leaves, so no. BT shouldn't be harming the beneficial insects in any way. It's an amazing product. And there are different types of BT that are used for different type of pests. So when you look up the BT, look for the specific bacteria for the pest that you're looking to control. You might see some incredible results. Okay, another question from earlier today. Myra Sharp, when should I fertilize my vegetables? How often to fertilize and what product is best? First of all, I don't necessarily promote just fertilizing to fertilize. If your soil is good, if you've taken some effort to really get some good soil with organic material, there should be enough nutrients that you might not need any fertilizer at all. It usually takes 3 to 5 years of amending your soil every year. In that case, fertilizer, it should be absolutely unnecessary because you've got a living soil that produces all the nutrients you need. Secondly, I don't necessarily would recommend a fertilizer not knowing that what nutrients are already in your soil. Now, I had a professional soil test done. I know that my soil is deficient in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and some other micronutrients. And so I'm amending my soil. I know I'm a couple years away from the good soil. So because I know my soil is deficient, I will be fertilizing after the plants are in the ground. And I usually give them a week or two in the ground just to start getting established. And then I'll throw a balanced fertilizer, like a 10-10-10 on the soil around those plants. And then let them grow. And then I'll fertilize again as they near the time of fruiting. So you start to see some flowers appear and some fruiting, then I'll do another balanced fertilizer, either a 10-10-10, maybe a 20-20-20 at that point. But I'm doing that because I know the deficiencies in my soil. As to the best fertilizer, it depends. It depends on what your plants need, and it depends on the deficiencies within your soil. So I don't like giving blanket recommendations as far as the fertilizer is concerned, because each of our gardens is different. And if I were to say, do it this way to your garden, well, too much fertilizer is actually a bad thing. And if you've got nutrients already in your soil from the last time you fertilized, then the next fertilization could actually cause more harm than good. So take a little time to do some analysis of your soil. Look at your plants. Your plants will often tell you if there's a deficiency. If you start seeing chlorosis, which is where the veins pop out, it's a light yellow versus a dark green, that tells you have an iron deficiency. There's those kind of things that you can learn about your plants. Learn to read your leaves, learn to see what your plant is telling you, and that can be a clue as to what fertilizers you use and when. Okay, good to see you. Round to it from London, UK. So good to see people in the UK. I think the UK, as I've said before, has some of the best gardening information, especially the gardening television shows in the UK just can't be beat. They've got flower shows that are national events. I wish the United States would follow some of the examples of the UK gardeners. So good to see you checking in. Johnny Castile is saying, since I transplanted my tomatoes, all the new growth on every single plant is stringy and the leaves are deformed and stunted. No herbicides have been used and it is not leaf curl. That's one of those issues. Leaf curl can be caused by many different things. It can be caused by pests, it can be caused by bacteria and fungus. The most common cause of leaf curl and growth issues is watering. Overwatering, especially for new plants, is very common and can lead to some of those issues. I would say have a little bit of patience, Johnny. Give it a few more days, another week, and see what other symptoms develop, and then do a search of the symptoms. So you can do a search of black spots on tomato leaves, and it might come back to tell you that you've got an early blight. If you look up leaf curl in tomatoes, you'll see that there's about 10 different causes. So look for other symptoms, and maybe that'll help you diagnose the issue. And I encourage you look into it a little bit more to try to diagnose it yourself. Okay, and this actually leads into a question from Larry Adams. I pruned my tomato plants, but in a couple spots I tried to pinch off too large a diameter of stem, and it took the skin off the main branch. Have I caused permanent damage? And so sometimes when we have an issue, especially with the tomatoes that we're all growing, and we try to solve a problem, we might create another problem. Yes, you could cause permanent damage if you're removing leaves or suckers and you tear them off the plant and damage the stem. It shouldn't be enough to kill the plant, but keep an eye on it. I prune off a lot of suckers, but I almost always like to leave suckers at the bottom of the plant for later. Because if I screw up, if I have a hailstorm like I just had that knocks the top off of the plant, well, now I've got some suckers at the bottom to recover. So I definitely encourage you to prune your tomatoes, but until you know that the stem is big and strong and growing, I also encourage you to leave some suckers at the bottom of the plant, kind of as a backup, just in case. Don't worry too much. Again, have patience. See how the plant recovers, and then that might give you the best answer as to how to proceed. A lot of times I say don't worry about it. Okay. Amsab, hello, thank you for the Q&A. I need tips, collard green beginning and mushrooms in the garden. God bless. So I had another question. I think I might get to it here in a little bit. That is also about mushrooms. And so mushrooms aren't necessarily a bad thing in the garden. And when the question was asked last week, Heidi also commented on this as well. When the organic material breaks down in our soil or from our mulch, there are two primary organisms that are breaking them down: bacteria and fungi. The bacteria primarily works on the plant-based material, and the fungi primarily works on the woody material. Well, mushrooms are just the fruiting bodies of fungi. So if you've got an active fungi network within your soil, which is great, strongly encouraged, it says that you have a healthy soil, then the fungi is going to fruit. They're going to send up the mushrooms to disperse the spores for another generation. So don't be too concerned about the mushrooms in your garden. It might be an indication that you've got too much water in the mulch or too much water in your soil, so you may need to dry things out a little bit. But for the most part, don't be so concerned about mushrooms. I actually am glad when I see the mushrooms because it tells me that I have a balanced soil with both bacteria and fungi working to break down the organics, which are going to release the nutrients that my plants are looking for. Okay, Urantia Reed had asked, I have found grubs infesting my garlic, scapes, and onions. What to do? This also gets back to the same issue I brought up with the borers. Sometimes when you have a pest in place, there isn't a lot that you can do, especially if your onions and your garlic show signs that they're already tunneling into the roots and they're infecting the part of the plant that we actually want to harvest. This is one of those things where a systemic pesticide is too late. It's not going to work. They're already in the plant and they're damaging the roots that we want to eat. One of the ways you can deal with this is to try to remove the infected plants as much as possible. Actually get down there, dig around the roots, see if it's infected. If it's not infected, you might be able to keep it in the ground for a little bit, but that means that those pests are already in the soil. So be ready to do an early harvest. For onions and garlic, they may not have reached the full size that you were hoping to get to, but it's better to harvest them early and get the good ones that haven't been infected yet or affected yet, rather than just wait until the normal harvest time and then have all of them be damaged. So look at a lot of the other onions and garlic and see how they're doing and consider an early harvest. Let's get to a question from last week. Vic Wilder had asked, my bush beans went from being deep green to a pale light green. I think I overwatered. Will the color come back? This is another great question. And this holds true with a lot of the pest issues, a lot of the disease issues. Once there is cell damage in the leaves, then no, the leaf is probably not going to recover. And if you overwater or underwater, especially the lower leaves on plants, like tomatoes, are going to be the ones that the plant sacrifices first. In an effort to keep the growing tip and new leaves alive, the plant is going to take the energy from those lower leaves and send it up to the new leaves. So you'll see pale green, you'll see yellow, you might see browning, usually in the lower leaves. They're not typically going to recover because there is cellular damage associated with that. The same holds true with a lot of the other things. If a bug eats your leaf, that leaf is not going to grow to recover the holes or what other damage the pest might have given. So it's okay. That's what happens. Those leaves will eventually fall off. As long as the new growth is a nice green color, everything will be fine. If you notice that the new growth, the growing tips in particular, are also turning yellow, then that shows it's a much more serious issue. It could be disease related. It could mean the plant is dying. Definitely do an analysis of your soil to make sure that you're not overwatering or underwatering. Try to correct the condition before it gets that bad. Okay, Kishan Nayak is asking, how do you know when a plant needs fertilizer? So I touched a little bit on that as far as a chlorosis, for instance, and how the color of the leaf will tell you. The growth rate will also tell you. Sometimes plants just get stunted. This is where you need to know your garden. And gardeners really develop a relationship with their soil, a relationship with their garden. So if you know that your soil is poor, and then your plants look stunted, or they look pale green, they're just not growing, your plant is telling you, just like you should already know, that the soil is deficient in nutrients. Usually the color shows that it's a nitrogen deficiency. So if it's a pale green and the plant isn't growing, a boost of nitrogen should green up the plant and get it growing strong. If the plant is leggy or stringy or just not in the shape that the plant should be, well, that's often a potassium deficiency. In fact, it might actually, you'll notice some purple coloring of the plant that will show that it's deficient in some of these nutrients. If the roots aren't developing, if you're not getting the flower and the fruit development, it could be a phosphorus deficiency. So there's lots of other problems that will be exposed that will indicate what you need. I encourage you to learn to search. Just identify what the symptoms are of your plant. Do a search of it. It should give you a clue as to the potential causes. And if you have a good relationship with your soil and you know your soil is bad, then right away it's probably a fertilizer fix to give you the quickest and best results. Another question from last week from Chris B. My lemon cucumbers haven't started producing, but 2 feet away in different raised bed, pickling cucumbers have. Do lemon cucumbers take longer to produce fruit? Yes. Lemon cucumbers are a plant that I've tried to grow, I think in 3 different gardens over a course of 4 different years, and I just couldn't get lemon cucumbers to grow. I think they're very finicky about the humidity. I think they're finicky about heat. They look like they're cucumbers that are just bigger and yellow. That's why they're called lemon cucumbers. But for some reason, they just don't grow the same as regular cucumbers, at least in my garden. Now, I know other areas and other gardeners that have great success with lemon cucumbers, but this identifies, again, getting to know your garden, getting to know your plants, and sometimes we just can't grow things. I haven't tried to grow lemon cucumbers in probably 7 or 8 years because I just have never had success with them. Even when they were 2 feet away from the cucumbers that were doing great, they just never seemed to prosper in my garden. So you might have one of those kind of gardens. The other option is to move them to a completely different bed with good soil and see if they can recover and do well from there. Cup of juice. Gardener Scott, my jalapenos are still very small. They are nice green, but I planted them about 5 weeks ago. Should I maybe add more fertilizer? I would say have some patience. Again, if you know your soil is deficient, a fruiting plant does take more nutrition. So if you know you have marginal soil, sure, go ahead and add a balanced fertilizer at this time. But jalapenos, a lot of peppers kind of have plateau stages where the plant stays very small and then suddenly there's a growth spurt and there's flowers. And then the flowers stay on and it seems like we get no fruit, and then suddenly a bunch of fruit appears. And then the fruit stays very small and then suddenly there's a growth spurt. So my experience with peppers is there'll be these growth spurts and then it plateaus for a while. And then there'll be another growth spurt. And then especially with a plant like jalapenos, they'll stay green for a very long time. If you leave them on the plant, suddenly there'll be another spurt where they'll all start to turn red. And that's just the way peppers grow. So have a little bit of patience, but if you know your soil is deficient, then yeah, now might be a time to add some of the fertilizer and deal with some of those concerns. Chris B is saying that the lemon cucumber plants are big and healthy looking. So there you go. You just needed an extra week of patience for them to recover. And like I said, they're the same as other cucumbers, but they grow differently. So I'm glad to hear that they're healthy looking. I hope they stay that way. Okay, also from last week, Dustin Light had asked, my beefsteak tomato plant has black spots on all the leaves and are curling. It's been very humid. For my research, I think it's early blight, but the spread this bad. Is the plant a lost cause? So first of all, kudos to you for doing some analysis, from doing a search, from seeing what the problem is. I encourage all of you to do this. Sometimes it's very easy to find an answer right off the bat if you just do a simple search with your symptoms. Blights are very common. It's a infection of our plants, most commonly seen in tomatoes, but blights are also the kind of thing that hits a lot of other plants, especially like apple trees. It's caused by a fungus. You can treat the plant with a fungicide, and that may help, especially if you catch it early, then later growth shouldn't be infected. Most of the time, if you've got a healthy garden with a healthy tomato plant, you'll still be able to grow the plant, you'll still be able to harvest the fruit, and things should be okay. I do encourage that you try to remove the infected leaves as soon as you see that they're infected, because it's a fungus. And the way fungus grows, it's like we were talking earlier about the mushrooms. At some point, it's going to release its fruiting bodies, which will release the spores, and the fungi are going to spread. To help reduce the spread in your garden of a fungal disease like blight, try to remove the damaged leaves or branches or any other part that you see is infected. And discard it. Don't throw it in the compost. Throw it in the trash. Get rid of it. If you see that the plant is stunted severely when compared to other plants, I'll often just write it off as a lost cause and pull up the whole plant to get rid of the infection, to stop the spread, and then focus my attention on keeping the rest of the plants as healthy as possible, to include the fertilizer and the watering and the pruning and all those other things to keep the plant happy. So if it's a small infection, get rid of some leaves. If it's a serious infection, you may have to get rid of the plants. And next year, consider not planting tomatoes in the same spot, because you already know that soil is infected with that fungus. Plant in a different area, and hopefully you can rid your garden of that problem in the future. Umberto de Leo is asking, what are your thoughts on wicking pots or beds and other DIY wicking systems? I think they can be good. It depends a lot on your weather and how you garden. Wicking pots and wicking systems are often intended to be kind of a water and walk away system, where you'll water the pot or the wicking bed, the water goes to the bottom, and then it wicks up into the soil, and the plant roots that are growing that deep will have plenty of water, and it's easy. You just keep that bottom reservoir filled enough so that the wicking system can work and the plants will do okay. I'm not a big fan of them in my area. Here in Colorado, we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of heat, and the humidity is very dry. And so my experience with wicking pots in my gardens in this really dry environment is I have to water so often to keep the reservoir full that it really adds very few benefits. I'm watering the same amount as I would in a non-wicking bed. And because you can be lulled into a false sense of satisfaction where you think, oh, I'll just water and the plant will do okay. Well, what could happen is the roots are getting water, but that top half inch of soil dries out. And then maybe the top inch of soil drops out. And the dryness actually starts working its way through the pot. The roots might be getting enough water to keep the plant alive, but the soil isn't getting enough moisture to keep the soil organisms alive. And it's those soil organisms that really provide the nutrition to our roots. So in my area, the wicking beds don't work so well because the bottom stays wet, but the top dries out. So I prefer hand watering and keeping a little better control over the top 6 to 9 inches of soil where most of my roots are actually growing. Good question though. Aracelius P had asked a question about manure in the garden smelling, asking for suggestions, and it was store-bought Home Depot manure. Well, manures should be well aged, and often if they come in a bag, you don't know how old they are. They should be aged. But if they start to smell, typically, as he was asking, it was on a hot day, it probably means that it's staying nice and moist, which is a good thing, and the heat just releases some of those odors. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And most of us have probably experienced that, where aged manure was spread on a lawn, and then it was watered, then it was a hot day, and then it smelled like manure. You're going to have that. If you are adding manure to your garden and it has a really strong smell associated more with an ammonia smell, then typically that means that the manure was young. There's a lot of bad bacteria that are moving into it. That ammonia can really cause some damaging problems. In that case, maybe remove the manure, or at least spread it out so it gets aged and dries a little bit more. But often, there are smells in our garden. They might be unpleasant. Just get used to what they smell like and what's good and what's bad. Again, this is a way for you to get to know your garden. Some smells are good, some smells are bad, and there's a whole bunch of smells out there that are neither good nor bad. So just live with it. Okay, another question from last week. Andrea Thorburn, I'd made a mention about green sand last week, and so she was wondering about green sand and what it is. So I've talked about using blood meal for nitrogen, bone meal for phosphorus, and green sand for the potassium. And green sand is actually mined from areas that were underwater. It is a marine mineral. And its main component, when you put it into your garden, is its ability to release some of that potassium. It's a very slow release type of fertilizer. It's more of a long-term amendment, but it is an inorganic amendment for your soil. Whereas the blood meal and the bone meal are organic, meaning they used to be alive. The green sand now is completely inorganic. It's a mineral. So that's what I was talking about when I was referring to the green sand in the garden. Okay, looks like great discussion. We're up to about 225 people. Heidi, thank you so much for all of your contributions. You're staying almost as active as I am. Okay, Nadine earlier today had asked a question, having issue with wilting strawberry plants. Transplanted on Saturday, and after 2 days, they don't seem to be coming back. Any ideas? Have some patience. Often in our garden, the best fix is to just wait and see what happens. Most plants, when you put them in, when they're transplanted, are going to be shocked. It's going to take a while for them to recover. And 2 days is nothing. 2 days of shock, 2 days of wilting is really quite normal. Look for the new growth. In a strawberry plant, in most of the plants that we're putting in the garden as transplants, the older leaves, again, are going to be sacrificed by the plant because of that stress. and the energy is going to be focused on the new growth, the new leaves. So even in strawberry plants that have only been in the ground for 2 or 3 days, you should be able to see inside the plant at the very center some new leaves starting to emerge. That's a good indication to just have patience. It's all going to be okay. However, if you do look and you see that the inside of the plant of a strawberry or a plant like tomato, if the growing tip is starting to yellow or turn brown, yes, now it's a serious issue. Most often, it's because of overwatering. We put our new plants in, we want them to be nice and healthy. We overwater them. We suffocate the roots at the time that the roots don't need to be suffocated. They're trying to draw all that oxygen from the soil to promote the new growth, and we're overwatering to the point where we're filling all of the pore spaces in the soil that should have air in them. We're filling it with water. We're strangling the plant. So look for new growth, relax, have some patience, and then take into account how you're watering so you don't unintentionally cause some of that long-term damage to your plant. Rurally retreated with Krabby's Homestead. Thanks so much for that super chat. Striped flea beetles. Is there a product to use in raised planter boxes over the winter months to get rid of these guys for next season? I'm not aware of a product. There's probably something you can put into your soil to deal with them, but I don't know off the top of my head. But this is another great one. Flea beetles are so common, and get to know their life cycle a little bit. One of the ways to deal with the flea beetles is to cover your young plants, to put row covers over the plants when you're growing them. So a small hoop system with row covers will help keep some of these types of pests from finding your plants. With flea beetles, as I've mentioned in some earlier live streams, I just deal with the fact that some of the plants are going to be sacrificial plants. A lot of the plants that these insects are attacking tend to be root crops, and I'm okay with that. So the turnips this year in my garden were the flea beetle magnets. They chewed so many holes in those leaves, but that's okay because I'm harvesting the roots, and I actually harvested some turnips yesterday. The roots look fine. The leaves look terrible. Understand what the plant is that they're most likely to attack. So in your garden, you're concerned about your raised planter boxes. Take a look at what plants that these striped flea beetles are attacking. And first off, think about whether it's a problem at all. If they're just attacking the leaves, be thankful that they're attacking those root crops and not the other plants. Also, don't be so concerned about it. When I was cleaning up my garden from the devastation that the hail inflicted, I noticed that I had a whole bunch of flea beetles because they were attacking these weakened plants. But there were a ton of ladybugs on those same plants. So flea beetles are food for a lot of beneficial insects. So it's one of those pests that I don't take a lot of effort trying to control, because they come in great enough amounts that they provide food for beneficial insects that take care of them, and then those insects move on to other pests. So sorry I can't give you a specific answer as to some boxed product to use, but get in the habit of mixing up your soil a little bit to disturb some of the grubs that might be growing, to disturb some of the eggs that might be laid. I do try to do that in the fall just to disturb life cycles of a lot of the pests I have, and then learn what pests you can live with. And often flea beetles they fall into the category of that kind of pest. So I want to do a shout out. KAYE turned 11 on Friday, and she has her own garden. She has basil and tomatoes and cucumbers, and is growing watermelons. So I think it's just so incredible whenever we have youth that are learning about gardening, that are moving forward with their own gardens. And so a shout out to KAYE, not only for your birthday, happy birthday, a few days late, but I think it's great that you're getting into gardening. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to let you know that you're doing it the way you should. Being young, learning something new, and gardening is a great way of life. Starting young means you've got that many more years of wonderful gardening adventures ahead. Okay, Basil Fables is asking, do you have a P.O. box or wish list? That's a good question. I don't. I've thought about putting together a P.O. box. I'm so busy with 3 videos a week and this live stream and answering a few hundred questions a day that I'm not ready to add a P.O. box or create a whole nother way to communicate with people. But I do have that on my plan, especially at some point when I move forward and enlarge the Gardener Scout channel and some of the other things I'm thinking about. I may add a P.O. box to just give opportunities so we can have some extra lines of communication, and it gives me a way also to send out some things. So if you remember, if you were one of the ones that watched my video about the Galileo Moon tomato plant that I'm developing, most of them were hit pretty hard by the hail, but this year I'm hoping to have enough tomatoes to save some seeds. And if we're lucky, this winter I'll be offering some seeds for the Galileo Moon tomato plant. Well, to do that, I'll want to set up a P.O. box. So look for more information if that time comes, but thank you for asking that question. Diane is saying, I remember hearing about eggshells and compost can be contaminated with salmonella. My compost bin has eggshells for at least 8 months. Is it a bad idea to add this to my raised bed? I've talked about eggshells in the past, the possibility of salmonella. A compost pile, unless it gets extremely hot, and we're talking the 160-degree compost piles, salmonella could be an issue. I've read that 6 months is a good time frame, that if you've had the eggshells in your compost for 6 months, the possibility of salmonella is greatly reduced. First, you should put the eggshells in the sun or in the oven before you add them to your compost, just to try to kill the salmonella from infecting the compost pile. If you have those concerns, and there are some minor concerns, you can still use the compost, but don't necessarily use that compost in an edible vegetable area. Use that compost for an area where you're going to have perennial plants or bushes or trees, or something like asparagus, where you could use it this year, but it's going to be exposed to a full winter and spring. There'll be plenty enough time for the salmonella to die. So do have some concerns. There might be enough time after 8 months. If given the choice, I would say choose a non-edible area of your garden. Okay, Romaine Anthony asked last week, do you recommend upside down planting for tomatoes? You've seen these products that you can put the tomatoes in a bag, hang them from your ceiling or some hook in your garden and grow them upside down. I've tried this. I don't think it's a great way to grow tomatoes. One year I grew tomatoes upside down. I grew them in straw bales. I grew them in bags of potting soil where you just make a slit and put the plant in, and I grew them in raised beds. By far, the plants that did the best were the plants in the raised beds. By just a little bit compared to the potting mix, the plants that did the worst were the ones that were hanging upside down. A plant naturally wants to grow up. The cells are oriented to gravity. So if you try to make a plant that's growing upside down, it's actually going to spend a lot of energy to get that stem growing in the proper direction. And that's energy that could be sent to the flowers and the fruit. So every time I've grown upside down tomatoes, the plants have been smaller. Partly for that reason, but also the bags usually aren't that big, and they're not providing enough room for the tomato roots to develop and give the plant all the nutrition. And because it's a bag, it's a closed system, Now it becomes difficult to fertilize if you want to add fertilizer and improve the system within the soil. So no, I don't recommend growing tomatoes in bags upside down. Courtney Willingham has earwigs in corn, and I am moving to a new house, or I'm sorry, I have to try daily diligence of taking them off by hand, but there are too many. Am I doing or not doing something wrong? No, actually, you're probably doing a lot right. Believe it or not, earwigs are beneficial insects. They are really great to have in the garden. They eat a lot of pests like aphids. They'll actually decompose a lot of the organic material. So you're probably doing things right to have earwigs in your garden. The problem is, if you get a good population of earwigs, they're going to have already eaten the pests and the organic material, and now they're going to move on to your plants, and they can cause substantial plant damage. There are some things you can do, and as Heidi suggested last week, diatomaceous earth is one of those options. Diatomaceous earth spread around the base of your corn stalks can reduce the earwigs. And the earwigs that do make it up the corn stalk are going to be injured to the point that they're going to die. So that is a consideration. I would also suggest the possibility of traps. You've heard about putting beer in a cat food can or a tuna can to trap slugs. Well, you can do the same thing for earwigs, but in this case, put oil, like a vegetable oil, just at the bottom of one of those cans, bury it in your garden. It's going to attract the earwigs and they'll die within the oil. So you can trap them. You might have some success with sticky traps, not a lot, but the oil traps and the diatomaceous earth are typically the best ways to deal with earwigs. You can also, just like slugs, take rolled up newspaper, wet it. You can take cardboard and wet it. Lay that in an area near your corn. The earwigs are likely to go to that really moist area. That's what they like. And then you can unroll a newspaper, see all those earwigs, and just throw them in the trash. Or pick up that cardboard and hand pick them as well. So there you have it, a few ways to deal with earwigs in the garden. Okay, another question from last week. Ann O'Brien, what's the best way to protect lettuces from chewing bugs? And this gets back to that overall philosophy. Birds, beneficial insects, and covering are the best ways to get rid of the chewing insects. Like I said earlier with the tomato hornworms, birds can be your best friend in the garden when it comes to a lot of these chewing insects. And with some of the other things like the flea beetles, if you put a row cover over your plants so that the insects can't get to them in the first place, when they're young in particular, then you're probably not going to have the damage. The other thing to do is just accept it. You're going to have holes chewed into your lettuce leaves. When you make a salad, just tear off that part of the leaf that has a hole in it if you don't want to eat it. The leaf is still perfectly good to eat. It just is not as good looking as we often like to have. Being an organic gardener and not throwing a lot of chemicals at our garden pests means we have to deal with some of that damage. So I normally don't think it's that big of an issue. I accept a lot of holes in my food. Liliet Cordoso, how much water do new trees need? It's 100 degrees here. So a general rule of thumb is that trees need 1 inch of water per diameter of trunk each week. So a young fruit tree that might only be an inch in diameter, using that rule of thumb, needs 1 inch of water per week. Now, I suggest, especially with new trees, keep the soil moist. Big trees can get by with a once a week watering, a once a week deep watering. But young fruit trees, especially in 100-degree heat, are going to be sending out a lot of new roots. And those new roots need moist soil. So you may need to water more often. Now, I've been getting into the 90s. I'm watering my new fruit trees every other day. And I'm giving them about ½ an inch every other day, regardless of what their trunk size is. Most of them are in the inch to inch and a half range. What I found for me in my dry area, watering every other day, about a ½ inch up to an inch, and letting it soak in, the soil will stay moist for 2 days. And then I give it another helping, because I want that whole area around the trees to stay moist for those roots to develop. Bigger trees, you don't need to water as often, but check your soil. Get in there on your hands and knees with your finger to see what the moisture level is, because above 100 degrees, you may need to water those new fruit trees every single day. If you find out that you water and then you come back 24 hours later and the soil is dry 2 or 3 inches down, then definitely you're not adding enough water. If you come back 24 hours later and maybe only the top of the soil, maybe a ½ inch is dry, but the rest is fine, now come back another 24 hours and see how dry the soil is and where that soil moisture begins. Because a lot of those new roots are going to be growing in the top 4 to 5 inches of the soil. So that's the target area that we want to make sure stays consistently moist. Okay, Heidi, I'm glad you're answering that question, because I actually was going to think about asking you the question. Rupa had asked, do you have a channel? And I've noticed you actually, not only you're very active on this channel, but I've actually seen that you've been active on some of the other channels, because I watch a lot of other channels. I watch live streams that other gardeners are doing as well. And so Heidi, to me, is just a great example of a gardener, the kind of gardener that knows a lot about gardening, but also is looking at other gardeners and getting their information, their advice, their recommendations, and the stories that they're telling. So while I think you have enough information to have your own channel, Heidi, I respect you, and I think you're doing great in increasing your own knowledge base. For all of you out there, if you're at all interested in starting a gardening channel, I say go for it. But I will say it's a lot of work. After many years of making videos, I have my system down pretty good. And I did a video recently, start to finish. The video took me 6 hours. And that's my best time yet. If I'm really doing well and everything's lined up, it takes me at least 6 hours from start to finish to get a video done and posted on YouTube. It's a lot of work. If you want to do a quality video, I'm after quality videos. Some of my videos take 8 to 12 hours to edit, produce, and upload. And you've probably seen some of the videos that take place over many months or at least many weeks, where I'll do shooting over a period of many